Most people never expect peace to become powerful. They think power looks loud, aggressive, emotionally dominant. They trust people who constantly react because chaos feels familiar to them. But the moment somebody becomes deeply calm, something strange begins happening around them. Manipulation loses its grip, emotional games stop landing, tension no longer controls the room, and without saying much at all, the peaceful person begins exposing emotions others worked hard to hide. This is why emotionally chaotic people often feel disturbed around calm minds. Your stillness forces them to confront the noise living inside themselves. Buddhism teaches that inner peace is not passive weakness. It is a form of emotional freedom so rare that many people mistake it for distance, coldness, or silent superiority. But in reality, nothing frightens a chaotic mind more than somebody who can no longer be emotionally controlled. Lesson 1. Your calmness removes their emotional power. Emotionally chaotic people often build invisible control through reactions, not always through shouting or obvious aggression. Sometimes the control appears through guilt, emotional unpredictability, tension, mood shifts, or constant emotional pressure that keeps everybody around them psychologically alert. Many people spend years adapting themselves to these unstable emotional environments without fully noticing it. They learn to explain themselves too much. They soften their opinions to avoid conflict. They monitor facial expressions. They become careful with timing, tone, and silence because they are trying to prevent emotional discomfort from spreading across the room. Over time, this creates relationships where one person unconsciously controls the emotional climate while everybody else slowly adjusts around it. But a deeply calm person interrupts this pattern in a way that feels almost invisible at first. They do not immediately defend themselves when tension appears. They do not become emotionally frantic when somebody tries to provoke insecurity inside them. Their nervous system stops participating in emotional chaos the way most people do. And this is where the imbalance begins, because emotional control only works when the other person can be emotionally pulled into confusion, guilt, fear, urgency, or self-doubt. Once somebody remains emotionally steady, many manipulative patterns suddenly lose their effect. The calm person may not even realize this is happening, but the emotionally chaotic person feels it immediately. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows stronger through attachment and reaction. A restless mind keeps searching for something outside itself to hold on to, control, or resist. This is why emotionally unstable people often struggle around individuals who no longer react in expected ways. The peaceful person becomes difficult to emotionally organize, difficult to pressure, difficult to predict. And for someone who unconsciously depends on emotional influence to feel secure, this creates deep internal discomfort. Many emotionally chaotic people are not consciously evil. Most are simply trapped inside patterns they never learned to see clearly. Their emotions move faster than their awareness. Their discomfort immediately becomes everybody else's responsibility. Their frustration spills outward before they even understand what they are feeling internally. So when they meet somebody calm, they encounter a kind of emotional stability that exposes how uncontrolled their own inner world has become. Not because the peaceful person is trying to teach them anything, not because the calm person is acting superior, but because emotional stillness naturally reveals emotional turbulence, the same way quiet water reflects every disturbance on its surface. This is why calm individuals often become misunderstood. Emotionally reactive people sometimes interpret peace as distance. They interpret emotional balance as coldness. They interpret non-reaction as hidden judgment. In reality, the calm person may simply no longer feel the need to emotionally wrestle for control inside every uncomfortable interaction. Buddhism does not teach emotional suppression. It teaches awareness strong enough to prevent emotions from controlling consciousness completely. That difference matters. A peaceful mind still feels sadness, irritation, disappointment, and pain, but those emotions no longer seize total control over behavior. When somebody cannot emotionally dominate you anymore, they begin losing access to the version of you they understood best. This can quietly disturb them. Many relationships unconsciously depend on predictable emotional patterns. One person gets upset, the other apologizes quickly. One person withdraws emotionally, the other chases for reassurance. One creates tension, the other rushes to fix it. These cycles become familiar forms of emotional structure, but once inner peace develops, those automatic reactions begin disappearing. The peaceful person starts pausing before reacting. They stop rushing to repair every emotional disturbance. They stop absorbing emotional blame simply to restore temporary harmony, and suddenly the old emotional system no longer functions the same way. This shift often confuses emotionally chaotic individuals because they mistake calmness for emotional disengagement. But true peace is not emotional absence, it is emotional discipline. It is the ability to remain connected to yourself while tension tries to pull you into unconscious reaction. Buddhism teaches that the mind becomes dangerous when it is ruled entirely by impulse and craving. A person who cannot sit with discomfort will constantly seek control outside themselves. They will seek reassurance, validation, attention, emotional victory, or psychological dominance because inner instability keeps demanding relief. But someone who has spent time understanding their own mind no longer becomes easily trapped inside these emotional storms. There is also something else that unsettles people about calm individuals. Peaceful people become harder to manipulate through fear. Fear loses strength when somebody stops depending completely on external approval. Emotionally chaotic people often rely on emotional intensity because intensity creates movement. It forces reactions. It keeps attention centered around them. But calmness slows everything down. Calmness creates space before reaction. And inside that space, manipulation becomes easier to recognize. The peaceful person begins noticing emotional patterns without immediately becoming consumed by them. This is why Buddhist teachings place so much importance on observing the mind instead of obeying every emotion that appears inside it. The moment awareness deepens, emotional pressure starts losing its automatic authority. You begin seeing how many people communicate through emotional force without realizing it. Some use anger, some use guilt, some use silence, some use victimhood. Some create emotional confusion so others remain psychologically unstable around them. But calm awareness weakens these patterns because awareness refuses to unconsciously feed them anymore. And perhaps this is what emotionally chaotic minds fear most. Not silence itself, not peace itself, but the loss of emotional influence over somebody they can no longer destabilize. Because once a person learns how to remain internally grounded, emotional chaos stops finding easy entry into their mind. Lesson 2. Silence makes emotionally restless people uneasy. Most people believe silence is empty. Buddhism understands silence differently. Silence is not emptiness, it is exposure. The moment noise disappears, the mind loses its distractions, and whatever has been hiding underneath begins rising toward the surface. This is why emotionally restless people often become uncomfortable around somebody who carries genuine inner stillness. The silence surrounding a peaceful person feels unfamiliar to minds that have spent years escaping themselves through constant emotional movement. Many individuals do not know how to sit quietly with their own thoughts. The moment external stimulation fades, anxiety begins surfacing almost immediately. Some reach for conversation, some create unnecessary drama, some start scrolling endlessly through distractions, some over-explain themselves, some interrupt silence before it fully settles into the room because silence forces them into contact with emotions they normally outrun. A restless mind becomes dependent on movement because movement prevents self-confrontation. The moment stillness appears, unresolved tension becomes harder to avoid. This is why calm people often make emotionally reactive individuals uneasy without saying very much at all. The peaceful person may simply be listening, observing, or remaining emotionally grounded, but their silence begins affecting the atmosphere around them. Emotionally restless people sometimes interpret this quietness as hidden judgment. because they are accustomed to environments where emotional noise constantly fills the space. They expect reactions, they expect immediate emotional feedback, they expect tension to bounce back and forth between people, but the calm person interrupts this exchange completely. Buddhism teaches that the undisciplined mind fears stillness because stillness removes its distractions. A person who has never learned how to observe their thoughts without becoming consumed by them will often seek constant stimulation to avoid inner discomfort. Noise becomes psychological shelter. Emotional intensity becomes a familiar rhythm. Chaos creates momentum that keeps deeper wounds temporarily hidden beneath activity, but silence slows the mind down enough for unresolved emotions to become visible again. This is why some people become strangely uncomfortable around individuals who do not constantly fill every moment with emotional energy. The calm person creates psychological space, and inside that space, emotionally restless individuals begin hearing themselves more clearly than they want to. They notice their impulsiveness, their insecurity, their need for reassurance, their inability to remain emotionally steady without external validation constantly feeding them. The peaceful person does not create these feelings inside them. The silence simply removes enough distraction for those feelings to finally become noticeable. Many people confuse silence with weakness because modern life rewards constant expression. People speak quickly, react quickly, defend themselves quickly, and reveal emotions immediately because slowness has become unfamiliar. But Buddhism views silence as a form of awareness. A silent mind sees more than a reactive one. When somebody no longer feels the need to constantly prove themselves through words, their attention deepens. They begin noticing emotional patterns hidden underneath conversations. They hear tension beneath polite language. They sense fear hiding inside aggression. They notice when somebody is trying too hard to appear confident because they are no longer mentally occupied with performing themselves every second. Emotionally chaotic individuals often struggle around this kind of presence because silence removes the emotional friction they unconsciously depend on. Some people feel psychologically safe only when they can predict emotional reactions around them. They expect defensiveness. They expect emotional escalation. They expect discomfort to spread outward immediately. But a peaceful person remains internally anchored even when tension enters the room. Their silence absorbs emotional force instead of multiplying it. And this absence of reaction creates confusion for emotionally restless minds. There are people who become nervous the moment somebody stops explaining themselves excessively, nervous the moment somebody no longer rushes to fill pauses with conversation, nervous the moment emotional pressure fails to produce visible insecurity, because many relationships unconsciously operate through emotional reassurance loops. One person seeks constant emotional confirmation and the other continuously provides it. But when somebody becomes deeply calm, they stop participating in this pattern automatically. Their silence no longer means withdrawal. It means they have become comfortable without constantly managing everybody else's emotional state. Buddhist monks have long understood that silence changes human perception completely. In silence, people encounter themselves more honestly. Without endless talking, distraction, or emotional performance, the mind becomes easier to observe. This is why meditation feels difficult for many people during the beginning stages. The body becomes restless, thoughts become louder, old emotions rise unexpectedly. The silence itself is not causing suffering. The silence is revealing how crowded the mind already was before stillness arrived. Emotionally restless individuals often experience something similar around calm people. The peaceful person becomes a mirror that reflects internal instability more clearly. The chaotic mind enters silence and immediately feels pressure because silence does not cooperate with emotional avoidance. It does not distract, it does not flatter, it does not emotionally chase, it simply remains present. And presence can feel deeply unsettling for people who have spent most of their lives disconnected from themselves. This discomfort becomes even stronger because silence removes many of the emotional signals people rely on for control. Manipulation becomes harder inside silence. Emotional probing becomes less effective. Passive aggression loses momentum when the other person refuses to emotionally scramble in response. A calm individual may answer slowly, speak carefully, or remain quiet until clarity appears internally. This restraint weakens emotional games because reactive energy no longer finds immediate access into the peaceful person's mind. But Buddhism never teaches silence as emotional punishment. True silence is not cold withdrawal. It is not passive aggression hidden behind spiritual language. Real silence comes from inner steadiness. It emerges naturally when somebody no longer feels compelled to emotionally dominate every interaction. Peaceful people do not remain quiet because they have nothing to say. They remain quiet because they no longer fear empty space between words. And perhaps this is what emotionally restless people struggle to understand most. A calm person is not searching desperately for control through conversation, reaction, or emotional intensity. Their silence already contains enough stability for them to remain connected to themselves without constant external noise reinforcing their identity. For a restless mind accustomed to emotional movement, this kind of stillness can feel almost unsettlingly powerful, because silence reveals what noise was hiding all along. Lesson 3. Peaceful people stop feeding emotional chaos. Emotional chaos survives through participation. It needs reaction, attention, resistance, emotional urgency, or psychological entanglement in order to keep growing. Without involvement from other people, much of that chaos begins collapsing under its own weight. This is why peaceful individuals often change relationship dynamics without forcing anything directly. Their calmness is not only internal, it also changes what they are willing to emotionally participate in. And once somebody stops feeding unhealthy emotional patterns, many hidden tensions inside relationships begin revealing themselves very quickly. Most emotionally chaotic environments operate through unconscious emotional exchanges that repeat over and over again. One person becomes offended too easily, another rushes to repair the discomfort, one creates emotional pressure through mood shifts, silence, guilt, or unpredictability, another becomes emotionally consumed trying to stabilize the situation. Over time, these exchanges become automatic. People stop recognizing how exhausting the cycle actually is because the emotional pattern has become normal to them. They believe this tension is simply part of love, family, friendship, or human connection. But Buddhism teaches that suffering deepens when attachment keeps pulling the mind into repetitive emotional cycles without awareness. The mind becomes conditioned to react automatically instead of seeing clearly. This is why peaceful people slowly begin stepping outside emotional patterns that once controlled them completely, not because they no longer care about others, but because awareness changes what the mind is willing to nourish. A peaceful person eventually notices how many emotional conflicts continue only because everybody involved keeps feeding the energy unconsciously. One angry comment produces another, one accusation creates defensiveness, one emotional outburst spreads tension across the entire environment. And most people never pause long enough to ask whether their reaction is actually helping the situation or merely extending it. The emotionally chaotic mind believes every emotion deserves immediate expression. Buddhism teaches something very different. It teaches observation before reaction, awareness before impulse, stillness before emotional momentum gains control over consciousness. This shift changes everything inside relationships. A peaceful person no longer feels compelled to respond emotionally to every emotional disturbance placed in front of them. When somebody projects frustration onto them, they do not immediately absorb it as personal truth. When somebody attempts to provoke guilt, insecurity, or emotional urgency, they pause instead of reacting automatically. This pause becomes extremely important because emotional chaos depends heavily on speed. The faster people react emotionally, the less awareness enters the situation. Impulse takes control before clarity has time to arrive. Emotionally chaotic individuals often become uncomfortable around peaceful people because they sense this interruption immediately. Their usual emotional patterns stop producing the same results. The guilt no longer creates panic, the tension no longer creates emotional scrambling, the dramatic withdrawal no longer forces desperate chasing. And because the peaceful person is no longer unconsciously feeding the emotional cycle, the chaotic individual suddenly feels the instability of their own emotional behavior more directly. This can create confusion inside relationships because many people mistake emotional intensity for emotional connection. They believe constant emotional turbulence proves passion, importance, or closeness. But Buddhism understands that attachment often disguises itself as love, while actually producing suffering beneath the surface. A relationship built entirely on emotional highs and lows eventually drains the nervous system. People become addicted to emotional stimulation because calmness starts feeling unfamiliar to them. They stop recognizing peace as connection because chaos has trained them to associate instability with emotional depth. A peaceful person slowly breaks this conditioning. They stop rewarding emotional volatility with excessive attention. They stop participating in circular arguments that exist only to release emotional frustration temporarily. They stop explaining themselves endlessly to people committed to misunderstanding them emotionally. They stop allowing every emotional storm to pull them into psychological exhaustion. And once this happens, emotionally chaotic individuals sometimes accuse the peaceful person of changing, becoming distant, or becoming emotionally unavailable. But often what has actually changed is emotional dependency. The peaceful person no longer feeds unhealthy emotional habits the way they once did. They no longer stabilize everybody else while neglecting their own internal balance. Buddhism teaches compassion, but compassion is not emotional self-destruction. Many people confuse the two. They believe constantly absorbing emotional instability proves kindness. In reality, unconscious emotional absorption frequently creates resentment, exhaustion, and internal fragmentation over time. Peaceful individuals begin recognizing that not every emotional reaction deserves participation. Some people do not want resolution. They want emotional discharge. They want somebody else to carry the emotional weight they cannot regulate internally. And if another person continuously absorbs this emotional overflow without awareness, the cycle strengthens itself repeatedly. Buddhism teaches that awareness interrupts suffering at its source, rather than endlessly managing its symptoms. This is why calm people sometimes appear emotionally harder to reach. Not because they lack emotion, but because they have learned the difference between genuine connection and emotional entanglement. Emotional entanglement pulls people into confusion, instability, guilt, and reactive cycles that slowly consume mental clarity. Genuine connection creates understanding without emotional possession. It allows emotions to exist without allowing emotions to dominate the entire relationship. Many emotionally chaotic individuals unconsciously fear this change because they have spent much of their lives using emotional intensity to maintain closeness with others. Some learned early that calmness meant abandonment, emotional neglect, or disconnection. Others grew up in environments where emotional unpredictability became the normal rhythm of relationships. So when they meet somebody peaceful, they sometimes interpret emotional steadiness as emotional absence because their nervous system has become conditioned to expect chaos as proof of care. But Buddhism teaches that peace is not emotional emptiness. Peace is emotional balance that no longer depends on constant turbulence to feel alive. A peaceful person still cares deeply. They still feel sadness, disappointment, affection, grief, and love. But these emotions no longer control their behavior completely. Their awareness becomes stronger than emotional impulse. And because of this, they stop feeding emotional fires that only create more suffering for everyone involved. There is also a deeper reason emotionally chaotic people struggle around peaceful individuals. Calm people quietly expose how much emotional noise other people have normalized inside themselves. When somebody no longer reacts dramatically, the contrast becomes visible immediately. The peaceful person is not trying to dominate the room, yet their grounded presence naturally reveals how unstable the emotional environment has become. Their restraint highlights everybody else's impulsiveness, Their patience reveals everybody else's urgency. Their inner steadiness exposes how many interactions are secretly fueled by insecurity, fear, control, or emotional hunger. This is why emotionally chaotic individuals sometimes intensify their behavior around peaceful people at first. They unconsciously push harder for reactions because their usual emotional methods are failing. They create more pressure, more guilt, more tension, or more emotional confusion, hoping to pull the peaceful person back into the old dynamic. But if the calm individual remains internally grounded, the emotional cycle eventually begins losing energy, because emotional chaos cannot survive forever without participation. And once somebody learns how to stop feeding emotional instability with unconscious reaction, they begin protecting something most people lose very early in life: the quiet stability of their own mind. Lesson 4. Your peace exposes emotional immaturity. One of the quietest truths Buddhism reveals is that people do not always become uncomfortable because somebody is cruel, arrogant, or harmful. Sometimes they become uncomfortable because another person reflects a level of emotional balance they have not yet developed within themselves. This is why peaceful individuals often trigger emotional reactions without intending to. Their calmness creates contrast, and contrast reveals things people normally avoid seeing inside their own behavior. Emotional immaturity is not about age. Many adults carry emotional habits that were formed during fear, insecurity, rejection, or instability earlier in life. The body grows older, but emotional patterns remain unchanged because nobody taught them how to observe themselves honestly. So they continue reacting impulsively, seeking emotional control, avoiding accountability, and protecting fragile egos without fully understanding why. Over time, these habits become automatic. They stop appearing unusual because the person has repeated them for so long that they now feel natural. But a peaceful person quietly interrupts this illusion. When somebody remains emotionally steady during conflict, emotionally immature people suddenly become more visible to themselves. The contrast exposes behaviors they normally justify internally. Their defensiveness becomes more obvious. Their impulsiveness becomes harder to hide. Their need for control becomes clearer. And because most people are not comfortable confronting these parts of themselves directly, they often project discomfort outward instead. This is why emotionally immature individuals sometimes accuse calm people of acting superior, even when no superiority exists. The peaceful person may simply be listening carefully, speaking calmly, or refusing to emotionally escalate a situation. Yet the emotionally reactive person begins feeling judged internally because deep down they sense the imbalance between reaction and awareness. The peaceful person becomes a mirror they did not ask to stand in front of. Buddhism teaches that awareness naturally exposes unconscious behavior. The moment consciousness deepens, patterns that once operated invisibly become easier to recognize. A person begins noticing how much suffering enters life through attachment, ego protection, emotional impulsiveness, and fear-based reactions. But many people spend most of their lives avoiding this level of self-observation because honest awareness can feel deeply uncomfortable during the beginning. It requires humility, it requires responsibility, it requires admitting that not every emotional reaction reflects truth. Emotionally immature individuals often struggle with this because they experience emotions as absolute reality. If they feel offended, they assume someone must be wrong. If they feel insecure, they assume someone else caused it. If they feel emotionally unsettled, they immediately search for an external explanation instead of looking inward first. Their inner world becomes entirely reaction-based. Buddhism teaches the opposite approach. It teaches observation before identification. Feelings are acknowledged, but they are not blindly obeyed. This difference becomes extremely noticeable around peaceful people. A calm individual may pause before responding during emotional tension. They may refuse to match aggression with aggression. They may remain grounded while another person becomes increasingly reactive. And this emotional restraint often frustrates emotionally immature individuals because they unconsciously expect emotional synchronization. They expect their anger to create anger, their panic to create panic, their insecurity to create defensiveness. But when the peaceful person refuses to enter the emotional storm, the immature mind begins losing emotional leverage. Many emotionally immature people rely heavily on emotional reactions because reactions help them avoid deeper self-awareness. If they can keep the focus on external conflict, they do not have to confront their own instability internally. This is why some individuals constantly create emotional drama around themselves without realizing it. Chaos distracts them from self-confrontation. Emotional conflict becomes psychological noise that prevents deeper reflection from happening, but peaceful individuals weaken this distraction simply through their presence. Their calmness slows the emotional environment down, and when emotional speed decreases, hidden immaturity becomes easier to see. The person who constantly interrupts others suddenly looks emotionally impatient. The person who cannot tolerate disagreement suddenly appears fragile beneath their confidence. The person who manipulates emotionally through guilt or withdrawal suddenly becomes transparent once their tactics stop producing the same emotional results. This exposure often creates resentment because emotionally immature individuals mistake emotional comfort for emotional truth. They want environments where their behavior remains unchallenged psychologically. They want reactions that validate their emotional patterns automatically. But peaceful people do not provide this kind of unconscious reinforcement anymore. Not because they are trying to teach lessons, not because they are trying to appear enlightened. Their inner balance simply changes what they emotionally cooperate with. Buddhism has always warned about the dangers of ego attachment, because the ego resists anything that threatens its self-image. Emotionally immature people often build identities around being right, being needed, being admired, being emotionally dominant, or being constantly validated. So when they encounter somebody who no longer depends heavily on emotional approval, they feel destabilized without fully understanding why. The peaceful person's self-containment quietly challenges their entire emotional structure. There is something deeply unsettling about meeting somebody who does not desperately need emotional control over others. Most people are accustomed to emotional bargaining in relationships. Approval is exchanged for compliance, attention is exchanged for reassurance. Emotional closeness becomes entangled with control, dependency, fear, or validation. But peaceful people begin moving differently. They stop chasing emotional victories. They stop needing constant reassurance to feel internally stable. And because of this, emotionally immature individuals often struggle to understand their behavior. Sometimes they interpret calmness as hidden arrogance because they cannot imagine emotional stability existing without superiority attached to it. Sometimes they interpret boundaries as rejection because they are accustomed to emotional access without restraint. Sometimes they interpret emotional steadiness as emotional coldness because chaos has shaped their understanding of connection for so long that peace now feels emotionally unfamiliar. This is why emotional maturity requires more than kindness. It requires self-awareness strong enough to examine your own reactions honestly. Buddhism teaches that suffering often grows from unconscious attachment to ego-driven emotions. A mature mind gradually learns how to sit with discomfort without immediately projecting it onto others. It learns how to separate temporary emotion from deeper truth. It learns how to remain accountable for its own inner state, rather than demanding the external world constantly regulate it emotionally. Peaceful individuals usually develop this understanding through pain, reflection, solitude, and long periods of inner observation. Their calmness is not accidental. It often comes after years of emotional exhaustion, disappointment, confusion, or inner conflict. They learn slowly that reacting impulsively rarely creates clarity. They realize emotional intensity does not automatically create wisdom. They begin understanding that protecting inner balance matters more than winning emotional battles that leave the mind disturbed for days afterward. And this is why their presence can quietly expose emotional immaturity in others. Not because they are perfect, not because they never struggle emotionally, but because they are no longer fully controlled by every emotion that passes through them. Their awareness has become stronger than their impulse to react automatically. The emotionally immature mind notices this difference immediately, even if it cannot explain it clearly. Somewhere internally, it recognizes a form of stability it has not yet developed within itself. And instead of inspiring reflection, this contrast sometimes produces irritation, defensiveness, mockery, or emotional resistance because self-awareness feels threatening when the ego has spent years avoiding it. But Buddhism teaches that true growth begins precisely at this point. The moment a person becomes willing to see their own emotional patterns without denial, blame, or avoidance, transformation finally becomes possible. Until then, the mind remains trapped inside the same emotional reactions, repeating the same suffering, while believing the problem always exists somewhere outside itself. And peaceful people remind emotionally immature minds of this truth, without speaking a single word. Lesson 5. Calm people no longer fear being alone. One of the deepest changes that happens inside a peaceful person is not visible from the outside immediately. It does not appear through confidence, status, appearance, or loud self-assurance. It appears quietly through emotional independence. Calm people eventually reach a point where being alone no longer feels like emotional danger, and this changes the entire structure of how they move through relationships, conversations, conflict, and attachment. Most people are far more afraid of loneliness than they openly admit. Even when surrounded by others, many minds remain constantly searching for reassurance, attention, emotional confirmation, or a sense of belonging strong enough to silence their internal discomfort. This fear shapes countless human behaviors beneath the surface. People remain inside unhealthy relationships long after peace has disappeared. They tolerate disrespect because emptiness feels more frightening than emotional exhaustion. They continuously seek distraction through noise, attention, romance, approval, or social connection because silence with themselves feels unfamiliar. Buddhism teaches that attachment often grows strongest where fear remains unexamined. A person who cannot sit peacefully with themselves becomes emotionally dependent on external conditions to regulate their inner world. Their sense of worth begins shifting according to how others treat them. Approval creates temporary emotional stability. Rejection creates collapse. Attention creates emotional elevation. Distance creates anxiety. Their inner state becomes controlled by forces outside themselves because they have never fully learned how to remain internally grounded alone. But calm people begin changing the moment they stop viewing solitude as emotional punishment. This transformation usually does not happen easily. Most peaceful individuals were not born emotionally detached from loneliness. Many once feared abandonment deeply. Many once chased reassurance from people who continuously destabilized them emotionally. Many once over-explained themselves, overextended themselves, and over-sacrificed their peace simply to avoid losing connection. But eventually, exhaustion teaches them something attachment could not. They realize that constantly abandoning themselves to keep others close creates a different kind of loneliness entirely, a far deeper loneliness, the loneliness of losing connection with your own mind. This realization changes people slowly. They begin spending more time in reflection, more time observing their thoughts, more time away from emotional chaos. And during the beginning, this solitude often feels uncomfortable because the mind has spent years depending on stimulation and external validation for emotional regulation. Silence feels unfamiliar, empty space feels heavy. The nervous system keeps searching for distraction because it has not yet learned how to rest inside stillness. Buddhism understands this stage very clearly. The undisciplined mind resists solitude because solitude removes distraction. Without constant emotional input from others, unresolved fears begin surfacing into awareness. A person begins noticing how dependent they became on attention to feel significant, how dependent they became on relationships to avoid confronting themselves, how much of their emotional identity was built around being needed, wanted, chosen, or emotionally pursued. This confrontation can feel painful at first, but peaceful people continue walking through it instead of escaping from it endlessly, and gradually something inside them changes. Solitude stops feeling empty. It starts feeling clear. Their mind becomes quieter. Their emotions become easier to understand. Their nervous system stops living in constant anticipation of emotional instability. And once this shift happens, relationships stop controlling them the same way. Emotionally chaotic people often struggle deeply around individuals who are no longer afraid of being alone, because fear of loneliness creates enormous emotional leverage inside relationships. Many manipulative dynamics depend entirely on the assumption that the other person fears separation more than emotional suffering. Control becomes easier when somebody is terrified of abandonment. Emotional pressure becomes effective when somebody believes losing the relationship means losing their emotional stability completely. But calm people slowly stop operating from this fear. This does not mean they stop caring about people. Buddhism never teaches emotional coldness or isolation from human connection. Instead, it teaches non-attachment. There is a profound difference between love and emotional dependence. Dependence says, "Without you, I collapse." Peace says, "I care for you deeply, but I do not disappear without your presence." This difference changes the emotional energy inside every relationship. A peaceful person no longer clings desperately during emotional distance. They no longer panic immediately when somebody withdraws attention. They no longer lose themselves trying to maintain emotional control over situations they cannot force. Their calmness comes from understanding that inner stability cannot permanently depend on another person's moods, choices, or emotional availability. This is precisely why emotionally chaotic individuals sometimes become unsettled around calm people. They sense that emotional manipulation has lost much of its power. Guilt becomes weaker. Emotional withdrawal becomes weaker. Threats of abandonment lose intensity because the peaceful person has already learned how to survive emotionally without constant external reassurance. Many emotionally reactive individuals unconsciously expect people to chase them emotionally. They expect panic when they pull away. They expect emotional scrambling when tension appears. But calm people begin responding differently, not from pride, not from emotional games, but from acceptance. Acceptance changes attachment completely. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when the mind desperately resists impermanence. People suffer because they try to emotionally possess what cannot be permanently controlled. They cling to people, identities, emotional roles, and expectations as though stability can be guaranteed forever. But peaceful individuals slowly accept that all relationships move through change. Some remain, some leave, some deepen, some dissolve. And once somebody deeply understands this truth internally, fear loosens its grip on the mind. This acceptance creates a quiet emotional strength that emotionally chaotic individuals often misinterpret. Some mistake it for indifference because they cannot imagine caring deeply without becoming emotionally consumed. Others mistake it for emotional distance because they are accustomed to attachment expressed through anxiety, possessiveness, or emotional dependence. But the peaceful person simply no longer measures love through panic. They have learned how to remain connected to themselves even during uncertainty. This is rare. Most people lose themselves quickly inside emotional attachment. Their thoughts revolve entirely around another person's behavior. Their emotional balance disappears the moment attention changes. Their identity becomes entangled with relationship outcomes. But calm people begin protecting something different. They protect their inner stillness. They understand that relationships should add warmth to life, not replace the foundation of emotional stability itself. There is also another reason solitude stops frightening peaceful individuals. They begin discovering parts of themselves that emotional noise previously drowned out completely. During long periods of quiet reflection, awareness deepens. They begin understanding their own fears more honestly. Their desires become clearer. Their emotional patterns become visible. They stop running endlessly from themselves through distractions, emotional dependency, or social performance. And through this process, solitude transforms. It no longer feels like absence. It begins feeling like a return to the self beneath all the emotional noise they once depended on. Buddhist monks have understood for centuries that a mind unable to sit peacefully alone will continuously seek escape through external attachment. This does not mean isolation is superior to connection. Human connection still matters deeply. Compassion still matters. Love still matters. But peaceful people no longer approach relationships from emotional starvation. They no longer expect another human being to permanently rescue them from themselves. This creates enormous emotional freedom, because once a person stops fearing solitude, they stop tolerating relationships that continuously destroy their inner peace. They stop remaining emotionally trapped by fear-based attachment. They stop bargaining away their emotional clarity simply to avoid temporary loneliness. And emotionally chaotic people feel this shift immediately. They sense that the calm person's stability no longer depends entirely on external emotional validation. Their mind is no longer easily captured through fear of abandonment. Their peace no longer collapses every time emotional tension appears. Because they have already learned something many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Being alone is far less frightening than losing yourself inside emotional chaos. Lesson 6. Your energy interrupts emotional manipulation. Most emotional manipulation does not begin with obvious cruelty. It often begins quietly through subtle emotional pressure that slowly shapes another person's behavior over time. A look that creates guilt, a tone that creates insecurity. Silence used to create anxiety, affection given and withdrawn unpredictably. Emotional approval offered only when someone behaves a certain way. These patterns are sometimes so normalized inside relationships that people stop recognizing them as manipulation at all. They simply adapt themselves around the emotional atmosphere without noticing how much of their peace is slowly disappearing. Buddhism teaches that unconscious suffering spreads from mind to mind when awareness is absent. A person carrying unresolved fear, insecurity, or emotional instability will often project those inner disturbances outward into relationships without fully realizing it. Their emotions begin influencing the emotional state of everybody around them. And if the people around them lack awareness too, they become emotionally entangled inside patterns that slowly drain clarity from the mind. This is why peaceful individuals affect emotional environments so differently. Their energy interrupts unconscious emotional manipulation because they stop responding automatically to emotional pressure. The manipulation loses momentum once awareness enters the interaction, and emotionally chaotic people often feel this interruption immediately. A calm person may not confront manipulation aggressively. In many cases, they do something far more unsettling. They remain emotionally grounded. They pause before reacting. They observe instead of absorbing. And this creates a psychological disruption because emotional manipulation depends heavily on automatic emotional access into another person's nervous system. Many manipulative patterns function through emotional speed. Somebody creates guilt, and the other person immediately feels responsible. Somebody withdraws emotionally, and the other person instantly panics. Somebody becomes cold, irritated, disappointed, or emotionally unpredictable, and the other person rushes to restore emotional balance before fully understanding what is happening. The reaction occurs so quickly that awareness never has time to examine the emotional exchange clearly. But peaceful people begin slowing this process down internally. This is one of the quiet powers Buddhism develops inside the mind. Awareness creates space between emotion and reaction, and inside that space, manipulation becomes easier to recognize. The calm person starts noticing emotional patterns they once unconsciously obeyed. They begin sensing when somebody is trying to control the atmosphere through tension. They notice when guilt is being used as emotional leverage rather than honest communication. They recognize emotional confusion designed to destabilize clarity. And once these patterns become visible, manipulation loses much of its emotional force. This does not mean peaceful people become emotionally detached robots. Buddhism never teaches emotional numbness. A calm person still feels emotional pain. They still experience disappointment, sadness, frustration, and grief, but those emotions no longer seize total control over awareness. The peaceful mind becomes less reactive because it is no longer unconsciously surrendering itself to every emotional wave entering the environment. Emotionally manipulative people often become deeply uncomfortable around this kind of presence because many of their emotional habits stop functioning the same way. Their guilt no longer creates immediate emotional collapse. Their mood shifts no longer destabilize the entire room. Their emotional withdrawal no longer forces desperate reassurance. The calm person remains emotionally connected to themselves, even while tension is present. And this changes the emotional balance completely. Manipulation depends heavily on emotional dependency. A person who fears losing approval becomes easier to control through rejection. A person terrified of abandonment becomes easier to influence through emotional withdrawal. A person desperate for harmony becomes easier to manipulate through conflict and tension. But peaceful individuals slowly reduce these vulnerabilities because their emotional stability no longer depends entirely on external emotional conditions. This is why emotionally chaotic people sometimes describe calm individuals as difficult to read. The peaceful person stops reacting in predictable emotional ways. They no longer scramble under pressure. They no longer rush to emotionally repair every uncomfortable interaction. Their inner stillness interrupts emotional patterns that once relied on immediate access into their fear, guilt, or insecurity. Buddhism teaches that awareness weakens attachment to emotional impulse. A reactive mind obeys emotional pressure instantly because it believes every emotion must be acted upon immediately, but a mindful mind begins observing emotion without becoming enslaved by it. The person notices tension internally without allowing that tension to dictate their behavior automatically. This creates emotional freedom that manipulative individuals often find unsettling because control becomes harder once somebody can observe emotions clearly instead of drowning inside them unconsciously. There are many forms of emotional manipulation people rarely speak about openly because they appear socially acceptable on the surface. Some individuals manipulate through victimhood. They create emotional guilt whenever accountability appears. Some manipulate through unpredictability, keeping others emotionally anxious and hyper-aware constantly. Some manipulate through emotional intensity itself, overwhelming conversations so completely that nobody else has room for clarity. Others manipulate through affection, offering warmth only when their emotional expectations are satisfied. A peaceful person begins noticing these emotional patterns without immediately hating the people behind them. This is important. Buddhism teaches understanding without blindness. Many manipulative individuals are themselves deeply wounded, fearful, emotionally immature, or internally unstable. Their manipulation often developed as survival behavior long before they became consciously aware of it. Some learned early in life that emotional pressure was the only way to feel secure. Others learned control because vulnerability once made them feel powerless. But understanding emotional suffering does not require surrendering your peace to it. This is where calm people become emotionally different. They develop compassion without emotional captivity. They stop confusing empathy with self-abandonment. They no longer absorb every emotional storm simply because another person is struggling internally. Their awareness becomes strong enough to remain emotionally present without becoming psychologically consumed. This creates a very different energy around them. Emotionally manipulative individuals often rely on unconscious emotional participation from others. They expect people to emotionally mirror them automatically. If they become tense, they expect tension to spread. If they become emotionally reactive, they expect the environment to react around them. But the peaceful person breaks this emotional chain quietly. Their grounded presence prevents emotional chaos from spreading as easily. This interruption can frustrate emotionally manipulative people because their usual emotional influence suddenly weakens. They may intensify their behavior at first. More guilt, more emotional pressure, more emotional confusion, more attempts to provoke reaction, because unconscious manipulation often becomes stronger temporarily when it stops producing familiar results. But peaceful people gradually stop feeding these cycles, not through coldness, not through cruelty, but through awareness. Awareness allows them to recognize emotional pressure without surrendering their entire nervous system to it. They stop over-explaining themselves to emotionally controlling people. They stop apologizing automatically for emotions that do not belong to them. They stop allowing somebody else's emotional instability to dictate their internal state completely. This changes relationships profoundly because emotionally manipulative dynamics survive through unconscious cooperation. Once awareness enters consistently, the emotional structure starts weakening. Some relationships adapt and become healthier. Others collapse because manipulation was the foundation holding them together all along. And this is why peaceful energy unsettles emotionally chaotic minds so deeply. The calm person's presence quietly exposes emotional patterns that once operated invisibly. Their stillness interrupts emotional control without needing aggression to do it. Their awareness weakens manipulation simply because they no longer react unconsciously enough for those patterns to fully attach themselves to the mind. Buddhism teaches that inner freedom begins when awareness becomes stronger than emotional conditioning. A person no longer lives entirely at the mercy of fear, guilt, emotional urgency, or psychological pressure. They begin responding consciously instead of reacting automatically. And once somebody reaches this level of inner steadiness, emotional manipulation starts losing the environment it needs in order to survive. Lesson 7. Real peace feels unfamiliar in a chaotic world. One of the reasons peaceful people are often misunderstood is because genuine inner peace has become rare enough that many people no longer recognize it clearly when they encounter it. Modern life conditions the mind towards stimulation, reaction, urgency, emotional noise, and constant psychological movement. People move quickly, speak quickly, judge quickly, attach quickly, and react quickly because the world around them rarely slows down long enough for awareness to deepen. In this kind of environment, calmness can start looking unusual, silence can seem uncomfortable, emotional steadiness can appear distant, and a peaceful person may quietly feel out of place inside systems built around emotional overstimulation. Buddhism has always understood that the human mind absorbs the energy of its environment very easily. A restless world creates restless thinking. Constant comparison creates dissatisfaction. Endless stimulation fragments attention. Emotional noise slowly becomes normal. People stop noticing how mentally exhausted they are because everyone around them appears equally overwhelmed. Chaos becomes collective. It becomes woven into conversations, relationships, media, ambition, social interaction, and even identity itself. This is why many people feel strangely unsettled around someone who carries authentic inner calm. The peaceful person moves differently. They are not constantly seeking emotional dominance inside conversations. They are not emotionally chasing validation from every interaction. They do not seem psychologically consumed by status, attention, urgency, or external approval in the same way many others are. Their nervous system carries a different rhythm entirely, and because this rhythm feels unfamiliar, emotionally chaotic minds often struggle to interpret it correctly. Some mistake peace for weakness because they have spent their lives associating power with intensity. They trust loud confidence more than quiet awareness. They understand emotional force more easily than emotional restraint. In chaotic environments, the person who reacts most aggressively often appears strongest on the surface. The person who dominates emotionally appears influential. The person who controls attention appears important. But Buddhism teaches something far deeper. A mind constantly controlled by impulse is not powerful. It is unstable. Real strength appears through inner balance, not emotional volume. Peaceful people begin understanding this slowly through direct experience. They realize how much unnecessary suffering enters life through unconscious emotional reactions. They observe how quickly anger spreads from one person into an entire room. They notice how fear changes behavior, how insecurity creates emotional performance, how attachment creates panic, how ego turns disagreement into psychological warfare. And once somebody begins seeing these patterns clearly, their relationship with the world starts changing. They stop participating in emotional chaos the same way, not because they think they are better than others, but because they finally understand how exhausting unconscious emotional living actually is. This shift can feel isolating during the beginning. A peaceful person often notices they no longer feel comfortable inside environments that once felt normal. Constant gossip becomes draining. Emotionally reactive relationships become overwhelming. Endless conflict loses its attraction. Conversations built entirely around comparison, judgment, ego, or negativity start feeling mentally heavy. The calm person gradually becomes more protective of their inner atmosphere because awareness has made them sensitive to how emotional environments affect the mind, and this sensitivity often confuses others. Emotionally chaotic individuals sometimes interpret peace as emotional detachment because they are accustomed to connection built through emotional intensity. They expect constant emotional participation and constantly reacting, constant stimulation. But peaceful people begin valuing clarity more than emotional excitement. They no longer mistake emotional turbulence for emotional depth. They stop romanticizing suffering simply because suffering feels familiar. This difference becomes especially visible in relationships. Many people unconsciously bond through shared emotional instability. They bond through mutual anxiety, drama, emotional dependency, constant validation seeking, or unresolved insecurity. These dynamics create emotional intensity that can temporarily feel like closeness. But peaceful people gradually lose interest in relationships built entirely on emotional survival patterns. They begin craving something quieter, something steadier, something less psychologically exhausting. And because this kind of calm connection has become uncommon, many people do not know how to respond to it. A peaceful person may speak gently without hidden emotional agendas. They may remain calm during disagreement instead of escalating emotionally. They may listen fully without trying to dominate the conversation psychologically. They may respect silence instead of fearing it. They may stop trying to emotionally control every outcome. And strangely, these behaviors can feel unfamiliar enough that emotionally chaotic individuals become suspicious of them. This reveals something important about the modern emotional condition. Many minds have adapted so deeply to instability that peace itself begins feeling emotionally unnatural. The nervous system becomes conditioned to chaos. Constant stimulation becomes emotionally addictive. Emotional unpredictability creates familiarity. So when genuine peace appears, the mind initially struggles to trust it. Buddhism explains this through attachment and conditioning. The mind clings to what it repeatedly experiences, even when those patterns create suffering. Someone raised inside emotional instability may unconsciously associate chaos with connection because chaos shaped their earliest emotional experiences. Calmness may feel emotionally empty to them at first because their nervous system has been conditioned to expect intensity instead of steadiness. This is why inner peace requires retraining the mind gradually. Peace is not merely the absence of conflict. It is the ability to remain internally clear without constantly depending on emotional stimulation to feel alive. But peaceful individuals continue walking towards stillness anyway. They begin discovering something the chaotic mind rarely understands. Peace creates depth that emotional noise cannot reach. A calm mind sees more clearly. It listens more carefully. It understands people more deeply because it is no longer drowning inside constant reaction. Awareness sharpens when emotional turbulence quiets down. Compassion deepens, patience deepens, clarity deepens. The person becomes less emotionally controlled by temporary impulses and more connected to stable inner presence. This is why Buddhism places such importance on mindfulness. A distracted mind lives mechanically, reacting to conditions unconsciously all day long. But an aware mind begins noticing the emotional machinery underneath human behavior. It sees how fear creates control, how insecurity creates performance, how attachment creates suffering, and once these patterns become visible, emotional chaos loses some of its ability to dominate consciousness automatically. Still, carrying peace inside a chaotic world is not always easy. A peaceful person may feel misunderstood frequently. Others may project assumptions onto them because calmness disrupts familiar emotional expectations. Some people may try to provoke reactions just to restore emotional familiarity. Others may interpret emotional steadiness as emotional distance because they are accustomed to relationships fueled by instability. And sometimes the peaceful person themselves may wonder why they feel increasingly disconnected from environments built around noise, urgency, or emotional confusion. But Buddhism teaches that awakening often creates this feeling initially. As awareness deepens, old emotional environments stop fitting the same way. The person begins valuing inner balance more than emotional stimulation. They stop craving constant psychological movement. Their priorities shift quietly from emotional intensity toward emotional clarity. And this transformation changes how the world responds to them. Because peaceful people carry something emotionally chaotic minds rarely encounter anymore: stillness without emptiness, calmness without emotional suppression, presence without control. Their energy does not pull others into emotional storms. It creates space where emotional noise becomes more visible instead. This is why real peace can feel so unfamiliar in a chaotic world. Not because peace is unnatural, but because chaos has been repeated so many times that suffering itself has started feeling normal to people who no longer remember what inner stillness feels like. The Buddha understood something most people never realize until much later in life. Peace changes power completely. A calm mind cannot be pulled as easily into emotional confusion, manipulation, or endless psychological noise. And this is why your stillness may unsettle people who are deeply attached to chaos. Your peace reminds them of everything they have not healed within themselves. But Buddhism does not ask you to become colder toward the world. It asks you to become clearer within yourself. Because once inner peace stops depending on people, approval, or emotional control, your entire presence changes quietly, not through force, not through dominance, but through a kind of emotional freedom that chaotic minds can feel immediately and rarely understand.